Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today I'm going to do another full fight review. I sort of made a promise to myself that I wasn't going to do many of these about fights that I was in, but this was a very good fight that I had actually I think a year ago almost now, but it just got uploaded to HEMA ratings and I was thinking about it. And specifically I wanted to showcase it because my opponent here does a very good job of making some very critical adaptations during this fight, and I felt like it deserved a showcase. So if you're new to this format, basically I'm going to go through the entire fight, exchange by exchange, talk about what happened, why it happened, and then specifically talk about what changes are being made throughout the fight to try to, get the best of the other person. So starting now. So I'm starting off in a Vomtog, and my hands are looking a little vulnerable. that first testing shot got pretty close to my hands, and I did not have a very adequate reaction, as I think you see here in a second. I eat one to the hands. So I have talked about this particular setup a bunch. It's, I think, a little bit more common in Saber, but it's very simple. You go up as a feint, and what this triggers in me is that defensive mindset. And as I say a lot of times, whenever you get your opponent into a mindset where they're just looking to defend, you have the advantage. So I go into my cron, and I'm basically just trying to guess which side he's going to attack on. He feints on the left side, I respond, and immediately he turns it over to my right side. And before I can get my crossguard back where it needs to be, it's just a little bit out of measure. He hits me right on the wrist, and I can't make it back in time. So specifically, this is smart because that probing strike that happened maybe 5-10 seconds before then did exactly what I said it did. It got very, very close to my hand, and despite the fact that it wasn't committed, it wasn't even really trying to hit anything. If you throw out something that looks like a hand shot and your opponent doesn't respond appropriately, you now know what you're going to do next, only committed this time. So that probing strike came out, he saw that my response was bad, and then he threw it for real, and it worked great. And I'm basically doing that classic thing where you try to copy the exact thing that you just got hit with. I don't know what it is about fighting in general, but somehow whenever you get hit by something, the next thing that enters your mind is immediately to try to copy it for some reason, even though that's a terrible idea most of the time. So a long exchange there. I'll try not to break down each individual thing too badly. So I start off with an offside thrust, which is a favorite of mine. It gets pushed offline because honestly, it probably wasn't going to land too easily. I was maybe a little out of range on that one, but I do a good job of pulling my hands back immediately. And I sit here and I wait for whatever my opponent throws. They throw that classic right Oberhau as a response. I parry it. It was going towards my head, so I parried about my mid. And I parry the second one because this shot here, right when this makes contact, does a pretty good job of not overcommitting. And as a result, this second shot can come. Now, theoretically, what would have been best to do is try to like countersverk this. But as you can see, I still hadn't completely gotten my feet where I wanted them to be. And I was a little bit closer maybe than I wanted to. So I parry the next one, and I try to immediately follow it up by coming down on top. But just as a little bit of bad luck, I think my opponent's crossguard was just in that perfect position because the second they landed here, they were in kind of throwing a middle howl, a left middle howl sort of, or maybe a Zverik arguably. And right as I come down, sort of the natural action of taking their left foot and walking forward pushes their arms up just a little bit, just enough to get that crossguard right in my way. So I missed that headshot by an inch. And then the follow-up comes. I parry that second follow-up. And now I think I'm going to fake him out by, instead of parrying on my left side and attacking on the right side, I'm going to parry on the left side and attack on the left side, especially given that he is crossing his step over to my right. This is the only target that's really exposed, and my opponent does a great job of throwing up that hanging parry, knowing that that's really the only place he can be hit, parries it nicely, and as a result, I do commit a little bit too much to this one. And I get stuck in his guard as he comes around with that hanging and that Oberhau on the opposite side. And because my arms are in this particular position, they're a little bit too far forward. He arcs it underneath where I think I'm going to catch it up here. He goes underneath, hits me in the body, and gets a nice blow off that. So right off there, what I should be learning from this is that I shouldn't go to long exchanges with my opponent. Clearly, his blade work is a little bit faster than mine. And if I go to those second, third, and fourth intentions, it's probably going to be a problem. In this particular instance, I try my offside stab again. This time it was a little bit better timed. I caught my opponent stepping to his left, which means his right side still had weight on it. With 1 foot in the air, he couldn't move this side of his body. And he was sort of in a left plow when he started, which means that the parry on this is going to be a little bit hard. I come very, very close to getting that, but I don't quite make it. But the good news is that once I do miss, I'm still in an okay position. My sword's still in front of me. I can still kind of parry things, even though my feet are in the air. And my feet, my opponent's feet are also in a state of disarray. It's going to be hard to come back from that. But instead of following up an attack, I try to pull my arms back to my chest, wait for that repost. It comes down, and it clips me on the side of the shoulder right about here. And that's just a little bit of bad luck in that one. I think that the end of that exchange probably could have gone either way. If I had committed to attack, we probably just would have doubled, so not great. Either way, that's what happened. So adaptations, my opponent has seen me throw that offside stab twice now. I probably shouldn't throw it anymore. And if I had any advice for my opponent, not that he needs it, is that he's got the point advantage, and clearly whenever these go to long exchanges, he sort of comes out on top most of the time. So what I would tell him to do is just be defensive. Wait for me to throw some of the wackier stuff that I have in my arsenal, capitalize on it, and punish it, because I'm in a position now where I have to start taking risks. And if you're not in a position where you have to take risks, it's okay to not take risks. And just as I say that, my opponent takes a risk. So he goes for this hand shot, and he commits pretty far on it. Now, it does look like it could have come close to hitting me in the hand. It also might have just been luck on my part that it didn't. But either way, I think the simple reality is that even if this did land on the hand, and maybe it did, this follow-up just was inevitable. When you commit that deep to a hand shot to the point where almost 30% of your blade is past the target, you're well within range for that follow-up. And the worst thing whenever you try to hit somebody in the hands is even if you're successful, your blade kind of gets stuck there, right here. And the result is that you can't adequately defend yourself even if you land that attack. So the follow-up comes and it lands. Everyone's saying it landed. Whatever. So this was an interesting one. I kind of try to wait for that baiting, probing hand strike, which I've seen a couple of times now. And just like before, when it was more committed, I immediately go for the follow-up over the top. And only this time, because it was a probing strike, my opponent was better able to pull their guard up. But they come in and they get a little bit too close. And I believe that here, I rotate into a hang and parry on my right side, and our blades kind of get tangled up here, just as we get a little bit too close. My opponent pulls their hands back to their chest, perhaps thinking that they had landed that middle how, or just thinking that we were going to separate a little bit too far away. And I come right back down onto actually it looks like right in the middle of the sword there. And it makes a little noise. They're calling a cut to the head. I have no idea what they're talking about, but whatever. Something happened here. I would have called that double hands or nothing hands. I don't know what they're talking about, but whatever. So far in the fight, there's been a little bit of a shift. My opponent has taken that slightly more defensive stance. They've arguably lost a couple of exchanges that were maybe not the best. I've maybe gotten 3 points that perhaps I didn't really deserve. But the point is it's tied now, and we're at the point where both people are going to start taking risks again. And I think what you're probably going to see is you're going to see a lot less probing strikes from this person over here. I keep saying it like I don't know who it is. And you're probably going to see a a lot more of that hand snipey defensive aggression from me, because whenever I'm tied up, the one thing I'm looking to do is put myself in a position where I can capitalize on my opponent's defensive mindset. Normally, there are two reasons when people go defensive. One is that they don't need to because they're up on points, but you can't be defensive when you're down on points. It's just not a general good plan. But the other way that you become defensive is when it's tied, because whenever people know that there's risk, they don't want to take those risks because there's not, a score padding to keep them safe. So when it's tied up like this, I find a lot of people choke back on their aggression and they stop throwing wacky things that they're not sure of. And what they do is they start trying to parry that first intention more, which, as you would think, is the perfect time to start doing wacky shit. But my opponent comes straight in with a kind of a right Zwerchhau, Schielhau kind of thing. Just maybe a very, very hard Oberhau. I basically make the assumption that it was going to be out of range. My opponent got a lot further in on this than I thought. And I think the result was that we both sort of just nick each other. My sword was sort of in the way of that landing anywhere other than my shoulder. And his sword was in the way of that really doing anything more than just kind of scalping the top of his head. I throw the follow-up Zwerch, which really only lands because my opponent has to spend that extra tempo landing with his feet. And for what it's worth, this is one of the things I absolutely love about the left Zwerch. The fact that you can throw a Zwerch from a position where both of your forearms are touching each other is quite an accomplishment. If that was a right Zwerch, it would have never made it anywhere. It would have been stuffed immediately. But the left Zwerch allows you to pull your hands back very far. You can see my right hand is pretty much at the level of my face. And what it means is that despite the fact that, again, our forearms are touching, this is still the mid-strong of my blade hitting right onto the target that I want it to. So I would have called it, obviously, again, what they're calling it, a double right from the first interaction. Still tied. All right, so I go for something a little wacky. What I basically tried to do is I feint this right Oberhau. That was a hand shot. I do get the response from my opponent. He pulls his hands back briefly to try to check that cut coming from over here, but realizing that it's a feint, throws a hand shot back. That luckily for me misses because my forearm right there was completely exposed. Probably could have hit there. And another bad habit of mine, rearing its ugly head. My point is way, way high in the air, so when I go in for this thrust, I misjudge the distance. My tip is so far down and off target where it should have been centered here that I don't quite make it in time. My opponent is able to parry it out of the way before it makes it to the target and then sort of fakes me out. So one thing that you know from fencing a lot of people is that whenever someone parries on one side of their body, 9 times out of 10, they're going to throw the follow-up cut on the other side that they parried from. And that's just basic biomechanics. It feels bad, weak, unintuitive, all of the above to parry one side and attack on the same side. And it's usually something that you have to train a lot. So when people are in this high pressure situation where they've just parried, most of the time they throw on that opposite side. I get put in this bad position here where I have again pulled my sword back to my chest and I'm just waiting to guess which side it attacks on. It comes straight down the middle and nicks the inside of my left shoulder right there before I'm able to clear it. And as a result, my opponent gets a nice hit on my shoulder. This is also another instance that the exchanges that go to more than one blow are heavily favoring my opponent here. I think he's trying to say that stab land. It did not. So that was why it doubled out and he didn't get his points, but whatever. I think he's wrong. It looks like I was a little way too out of range for that thrust. Right. So this is another thing that I will talk about in other videos, which is when you get used to thrusting with your tip offline, this period of time when you're trying to put it back online, the floppiness of the swords really works against you. So you see here, my blade is off to my right side a little bit and my tip is just way up in the air. And when I go to thrust, look at how much bend happens in my sword just from that adjustment because of how, fast and how much power I'm putting behind it with my leg. That by the time my point gets back online, My opponent's somewhere completely different, and he's able to just pop me right on the top of the head, scalp it right up the front of my face, and my thrust misses. Thrust misses. Wow. Yep, 2 points to him. And that was an interesting one. So we go right back to the exchange that we've seen a couple of times here. That probing feint cut, and this just barely nicks the front of my my glove. And I have another video on this, specifically the bad habit that I think a bunch of people have, which is when you're trying to void a strike, you tilt your sword back over your shoulder, because something about the human brain thinks I'm voiding what I want to void is my sword. And obviously that's not what you want to void. What you want to void is your body. So I do a good job of bringing my hands back to my chest here. And from here, I probably would have been safe. I probably wouldn't have been hit. But instead of staying where I was, I start shoving my right hand up to my shoulder. And what that does is it pushes my left hand out further than it was before. So if you look at this right here, my left hand's about there. Suddenly, it's actually an inch or two further out than it was when I had pulled it back, 3 frames ago. And that's ultimately the reason why he gets that hit right on my hands. I was thinking about going for that follow-up cut, but another good thing about this committed strike is that if you see here, because I've voided and I've gotten my body so far out of line, I actually don't have the angle to respond with that cut. You can't really see because I pulled it, but this would probably be just as far out of range as anything else. And because I did the kind of dolphin step thing that I talk about sometimes, I basically hopped off of my left foot, and right as my feet are landing, my right foot is coming off of the ground, which means I can't push any momentum forward. And what this is usually good for is getting someone to miss that little bit here and then responding, back. The problem is that my opponent just barely got the range on there, mostly because I contributed an extra inch or two. And if I hadn't done that, I would have certainly gotten out of the way. And this headshot might have been able to reach. But the reality is that I'd rather get out of the way and not be able to respond than I would to be able to get hit. And in this case, I picked the worst of both. I extended my arm a little bit too far. I got hit. And because of the particular footwork that I did not have the option to follow up. And I basically gave my opponent a free cut. So in summary, if you want to learn from this, one thing you want to look for is that a lot of times you'll face opponents who are good at a thing and they're landing things on you, but the thing that they're good at is resulting in the kind of pattern that they're throwing you into. So like I was saying before, my opponent was beating me every time we went to multiple blows because his blade work was just a little faster than mine. If you're in that situation, what you need to watch out for are not just defensive situations. You got to make sure that you're not just defending, because if you're the one defending, you can almost guarantee it's going to go to multiple blows. But what you have to do is you have to throw smarter offense. If I was coaching myself, what I would have said was keep that point online and make him deal with it. Because if someone is trying to deal with your point and your extended blade, you've got options that are not A, being hit in the hands, as I did, I think 3 times, and B, it's going to help keep that distance so that those multiple blow exchanges might not happen. If someone engages with your blade and you don't like the situation, you can take that step back because they had to engage with your blade at a range that was further out than they can reach you. All right, that's going to be it for today. If you'd like to see your own footage featured on the channel, feel free to send me an email over at HEMAFightBreakdowns@gmail.com, and I hope to see you next time.